If the early Virginia system was about controlling the land for the king, and the Plymouth system was about controlling the people for survival, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was about controlling the soul for God. This theological imperative produced a legal and administrative system that was simultaneously the most democratic and the most restrictive the colonies had yet seen. It was a complete, meticulously documented social blueprint. In 1630, John Winthrop led the Great Migration to Massachusetts. Unlike the Jamestown settlers, who were employees of a company, or the Plymouth settlers, who were unauthorized separatists, the Massachusetts Bay colonists brought their royal charter with them. This seemingly simple administrative act, relocating the company headquarters, had profound implications. In England, a corporation's authority rested in the mother country. By moving the General Court, the administrative body of the company, to Boston, Winthrop effectively turned the corporate charter into a constitution for a self-governing commonwealth 3,000 miles from royal oversight. The authority to appoint governors, enact laws, and raise taxes now rested entirely in the hands of the colonial residents. The Puritan belief in a covenant with God translated directly into administrative procedure. Only those men who could prove they were full members of the church, the freemen, could vote for the governor and the assistants, the executive council. This was a severe restriction, creating an oligarchy of the devout, but it established the powerful administrative principle that participation in governance was tied to moral standing and community commitment. The engine of local governance, the town meeting. As the population expanded, the General Court mandated that any new settlement must be founded by a group of 8 or more families who petitioned for the right to establish a town. This was more than just a geographic division. It was the creation of a miniature, self-contained administrative unit. The annual town meeting became the foundational administrative procedure in New England. Direct democracy. All male freemen, and sometimes non-freemen in certain administrative roles, of the town gathered, usually in the meeting house, to discuss and vote on issues directly. This was pure, unmediated democracy on a local scale. Local taxation. They levied the town rate, a tax on property and polls, people, to fund specific local needs, building roads, maintaining the meeting house, and paying the schoolmaster. This established the crucial precedent of local control over local finance. Local officials. The meeting elected selectmen to handle day-to-day administration, along with specialized officials like the surveyor of highways, the fence viewer, and the pound keeper. These administrative offices, small in scope but vital to local order, standardized community function. The power of the pen, record-keeping. Perhaps the most enduring administrative legacy of the Puritan colonies was their obsession with documentation. Driven by the need to prove their good governance to God and their legal right to the land, the Puritans kept records on an unprecedented scale. Church records, documenting every birth, death, marriage, and baptism, which doubled as the primary civic register. Town records, detailed minutes of every town meeting, recording votes, tax rates, and appointments of officials. Land records, a meticulous system for surveying, granting, and recording the sale of property, making land ownership clear and auditable. This administrative culture of meticulous record-keeping ensured a high degree of order and clarity in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, fundamentally contrasting with the often lost or poorly maintained records of early Virginia. This administrative precedent that good governance equals documented governance would permeate and define the future legal systems of the United States. The Puritan system successfully resolved the issue of local administrative authority, distributing it efficiently through the town meeting, However, this centralized religious control was fragile. It would soon face severe challenges from those who refused to conform, leading to the administrative development of new secular charters and the need to define the legal boundaries of religious freedom. The King of England had a simple way to reward friends, pay debts, and offload administrative burdens: give away land. A proprietary colony was essentially a feudal kingdom granted to a single person, the proprietor. These individuals, such as William Penn or Lord Baltimore, were given near absolute authority to govern, collect taxes, and distribute land. The administrative challenge here was unique. How do you convince free-born Englishmen to move to a quasi-feudal state? The answer lay in a dangerous administrative compromise. The proprietors had to offer more freedom than the king. This administrative patchwork of colonies, each with its own idiosyncratic founder, created a chaotic but ultimately fertile ground for diverse governance. The story of Maryland begins with George Calvet, the first Lord Baltimore, who sought to establish a safe haven for English Catholics. The colony's administrative structure was therefore highly personalized and designed to protect a minority faith. Lord Baltimore, as the proprietor, held vast administrative power. He appointed the governor, owned all the land, and was due a quit rent, a small annual fee from every planter. This quit rent was the administrative bloodline of the Calvert family and a constant source of tension. The administrative compromise was the Act Concerning Religion, 1649, often called the Maryland Toleration Act. This was a procedural act guaranteeing freedom of worship to all Trinitarian Christians. While limited by modern standards, it was an administrative breakthrough that attracted both Catholics and Protestants. However, the administrative procedures for governance quickly fell into conflict. Proprietors' power versus people's power. Lord Baltimore claimed the right to initiate all legislation, reducing the elected assembly to a mere advisory body. The assembly, citing the Virginia precedent and their rights as Englishmen, insisted on the right to initiate legislation themselves. The administrative result, decades of administrative struggle, resulted in a power-sharing arrangement, cementing the precedent that even in a proprietary colony, the elected assembly was the primary source of legislative action. This was a major administrative defeat for the idea of feudal control in America. Pennsylvania, the administrative utopia of William Penn. William Penn, a Quaker and the proprietor of Pennsylvania, embarked on the most ambitious administrative experiment of the colonial era. His colony was designed as a holy experiment, a place where government was for the people, not over them. Penn's administrative blueprint, the Frame of Government, 1682, was startlingly modern. Broad suffrage? Unlike Massachusetts, which restricted the vote to church members, Penn granted voting rights to all male landowners and taxpayers, a massive expansion of the administrative electorate. Religious freedom. The Great Law ensured that all those who believed in God could vote and hold office, allowing for a truly diverse administrative population: Germans, Scots-Irish, and various denominations. The Assembly. Penn created a dual legislative structure: a provincial council, smaller, proposing laws, and a larger General Assembly, approving or rejecting laws. Though intended as checks on each other, this system quickly devolved into administrative deadlock and debate. This administrative generosity led to Pennsylvania's incredible growth, but also to its administrative weakness. The rapid influx of diverse settlers who did not share the Quaker pacifist ethos often made the government difficult to manage. Their administrative procedures were too fluid, too democratic, and lacked the centralized authority necessary to enforce laws consistently, leading to frequent political instability. New York, the administrative legacy of conquest. New York's administrative procedures were a messy blend inherited by their Dutch founders and imposed by their new English conquerors. Under the Dutch, the administrative system was based on commercial interests. Land was given out through the patroon system, which granted vast estates to wealthy men, who in turn recruited settlers. This established an administrative tradition of large, semi-feudal landholdings in the Hudson Valley, unlike the small, self-sufficient farms of New England. When the English seized New Amsterdam in 1664, they faced a complex administrative task, integrating English common law and governance without alienating the established Dutch population. The Duke's Laws, 1665, named for James, Duke of York, the proprietor, were an administrative compromise. They permitted For decades, the colonies were allowed to develop their own unique administrative procedures: the town meeting, the head right system, the proprietary charter. But by the late 17th century, the Crown and England had grown tired of this administrative chaos. England saw 12 different administrations, 12 different tax rates, and 12 different trade regulations. This was not a system, it was a mess. The administrative goal of the Crown became simple and revolutionary: centralization. The period known as the Era of Consolidation was Britain's first major attempt to assert direct, uniform, and uncompromising control over the American administrative apparatus. This attempt taught the colonists the power of organized resistance. The administrative neglect of the colonies had a direct economic cost to the Crown. Colonial merchants were notorious for ignoring the Navigation Acts, a series of English laws designed to ensure all colonial trade benefited England alone. Enforcement was weak because the colonies, especially Massachusetts, controlled their own ports, customs officials, and courts. The Crown's solution was to bypass the complex, diverse colonial charters and establish new, direct royal administrations. 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Charter, the very document that allowed the Puritans to govern themselves, was formally revoked by the Crown. This was the definitive administrative declaration that colonial charters were privileges, not immutable rights. Administrative tool: the establishment of vice admiralty courts. These courts were key administrative instruments for enforcing the Navigation Acts. Unlike colonial courts, they operated without local juries, basing decisions directly on Crown-appointed judges. This was a critical administrative blow to colonial self-governance, demonstrating that England could create parallel legal systems to bypass local administrative control. The Grand Administrative Experiment, the Dominion of New England. The ultimate act of administrative centralization came in 1686 with the creation of the Dominion of New England. The Crown forcibly merged the governments of Massachusetts, Plymouth, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and the Jerseys into one massive super colony. The administrative structure of the Dominion was a stark rejection of every administrative procedure the colonists had developed. Abolition of assemblies. All elected colonial assemblies, from the beloved town meetings of Massachusetts to the proprietary assembly of New York, were immediately dissolved. The people were stripped of their voice. The tyranny of the governor. Sir Edmund Andros was appointed as the single all-powerful governor-general. His administrative power came directly from the king. Andros could levy taxes, dispense justice, and raise a militia, all without the consent of the governed. Land and taxes. Andros immediately began to challenge the administrative validity of existing colonial land titles, especially in Massachusetts, demanding that colonists pay new fees to re-register their property and impose new taxes without legislative consent. The administrative message was clear: local consent was irrelevant. Royal decree was supreme. The administrative counterstrike. the Glorious Revolution in America. The Dominion's administrative procedures were deeply unpopular, but it took an event 3,000 miles away to spark organized resistance. In 1689, when news reached Boston that the Glorious Revolution had deposed King James II in England, the colonists acted immediately. The administrative uprising was swift and procedural. The overthrow of Andros. Boston mobs led by prominent former colonial leaders rose up and arrested Governor Andros and his administrative officers. The mobs reinstated the old administrative structure, the General Court, before receiving any official word from the new monarchs. The reassertion of assemblies. Across the Dominion, the various colonial assemblies and town meetings simply resumed meeting as if they had never been dissolved, re-establishing local administrative control by sheer force of will and procedural tradition. The administrative legacy of the Dominion was profound. It created a common shared sense of administrative grievance across multiple colonies, something the colonies had never experienced before. It taught them two crucial lessons. Lesson 1. The administrative value of the assembly. The colonists realized that the elected assembly was their single most vital tool for administrative and economic control. Lesson 2. The administrative power of unofficial action. They learned that when the legitimate government fails to protect their rights, they have the power to overturn it and re-establish the traditional administrative procedures. Though the Dominion was shattered, the Crown never fully relinquished its administrative ambition. Many former charter colonies were converted into royal colonies by the early 10th century, with the king directly appointing the governor. However, the precedent for local resistance had been set, and the administrative battleground shifted from the governor's office to the colonial assembly's budget line. The years between 1700 and 1760 are often called the era of salutary neglect. The name suggests peace, but this period was defined by an administrative war, a silent, grinding conflict between two competing visions of authority. On one side, the royal governor, appointed by the crown, representing imperial authority. On the other, the colonial assembly, elected by the people, representing local power. This administrative battle forged an unspoken constitution, a set of procedural rules and political norms that were never written down, but which the colonists regarded as sacred. This era didn't create new administrative documents, it created new administrative realities. By the 18th century, most colonies were royal colonies, meaning the king appointed the governor, the executive, the governor's council, the upper house of the legislature, and the judges, the judiciary. On paper, the king held all the administrative power. However, the elected colonial assemblies, the lower house, possessed an overwhelming, immutable administrative weapon, the power of the purse. The British Parliament was busy with European wars and the administration of its rapidly expanding global empire. As a result, they simply delegated the routine administrative burden, including funding, to the colonies themselves. The administrative procedure? The colonial assembly had the exclusive right to initiate revenue bills, taxes, and spending. The assembly knew that the governor, who was responsible for the colony's defense and civil administration, needed money to pay officials, fund forts, and operate the government. Administrative leverage. The assemblies deliberately granted annual or even session-by-session appropriations rather than permanent funding. This meant the governor was constantly reliant on the assembly's good favor. This procedure effectively turned the governor, the king's representative, into an administrative supplicant beholden to the local elected body. If a governor vetoed a popular law or refused to appoint a favored assembly member to an office, the assembly could retaliate by withholding his salary or the salaries of the judges and military officers. The rise of colonial bureaucracy. This administrative dynamic led to the proliferation of powerful, locally controlled administrative offices.
The assembly, in its endless quest for control, created administrative positions and then vested the power to appoint those officers in themselves, bypassing the governor entirely. Treasurers. The most crucial administrative office was the colonial treasurer. While the governor was supposed to be the financial authority, the assembly created the office of an assembly-appointed treasurer who physically held the colony's funds and dispersed them according to the assembly's specific direction. This was a direct, successful administrative coup against the executive branch. Committee system. The assemblies began to manage administrative tasks through standing committees. These committees handled everything from printing money to supervising defense, essentially creating a shadow executive branch run by elected legislators, not the governor's appointed officials. The evolution of the judiciary. The judiciary, the third pillar of administrative procedure, evolved toward local control. While judges were formally appointed by the king, their salaries were paid by the assembly. This administrative reality reached a peak in the 1760s when the Assembly successfully secured the right for superior court judges to serve during good behavior, effectively for life, rather than at the king's pleasure. This administrative victory gave judges greater independence from the crown, ensuring they were more sympathetic to local administrative and legal precedents established over the decades. By the end of the salutary neglect period, the administrative reality of the colonies was starkly different from their legal status. Legally, de jure, they were subjects of the king, governed by a royal governor. Administratively, de facto, they were self-governing entities where the popularly elected assembly controlled.
The year 1763 brought the end of the 7 Years' War, securing Britain's dominance in North America. But victory came at a crippling cost. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled. London's administrative solution was simple. The colonies, which had benefited most from the victory, must now pay their administrative and defense costs. This shift marked the end of salutary neglect and the beginning of a relentless administrative assault on the unspoken constitution developed by the colonial assemblies. The debate was no longer about how to govern, but who held the legitimate administrative power, Parliament or the colonial assembly. The British government, led by Prime Minister George Grenville, introduced a series of new administrative measures designed to extract revenue and assert parliamentary supremacy. These acts were administrative in nature, aimed at bypassing the colonial assembly's cherished power of the purse. 1. The Revenue Acts, Sugar Act, 1764. The Sugar Act was the first administrative step. It was intended not just to regulate trade, but to raise revenue. Its administrative innovation lay in its enforcement mechanism. Administrative procedure. It lowered the tax on molasses, but strictly enforced collections. To eliminate smuggling, which was an informal administrative norm, it expanded the use of the Vice Admiralty courts. The administrative crisis. The act bypassed local courts and juries, striking directly at the colonists' administrative right to a trial by their peers. This was seen as a deliberate administrative procedural attack on their ancient English rights, regardless of whether the tax was high or low. 2. The Stamp Act, 1765. The Stamp Act was the decisive administrative flashpoint. It was a purely internal tax on all paper documents, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, land titles, requiring them to carry a revenue stamp. Administrative procedure. It was a direct tax levied by Parliament, not by the colonial assemblies. The administrative crisis. The assemblies argued that only they, the representatives of the colonists, had the administrative right to impose internal taxes. They articulated the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." To the colonists, representation was not virtual, as Parliament argued. It was actual, tied directly to their local assembly. Administrative resistance. The colonial leaders, particularly those who relied on the legal documents and newspapers being taxed, lawyers, journalists, formed the Sons of Liberty. They did not engage in political debate, they engaged in administrative coercion. They intimidated stamp distributors, forcing them to resign, effectively shutting down the administrative mechanism for collecting the tax before it could even begin. The administrative response: procedural resistance. The colonial reaction was unprecedented in its administrative coordination. The Stamp Act Congress, 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates to New York. This was the first major intercolonial administrative body created by the colonies themselves. They issued declarations of rights and grievances, asserting that the sole right of internal taxation rested with their own legislative assemblies. Non-importation agreements. Merchants across the colonies agreed to administratively cease importing British goods. This was an economic weapon that, unlike the taxes themselves, directly hurt British merchants and manufacturers, proving that the colonies could use unified administrative action to exert enormous pressure on the British political system. The administrative cycle of escalation. After the Stamp Act was repealed, the cycle of administrative control and resistance continued. The Declaratory Act, 1766. Parliament asserted its administrative right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a formal administrative rejection of the unspoken Constitution. The Townshend Acts, 1767. These placed administrative duties on external goods, tea, glass, paper. To enforce them, the Crown created the American Board of Customs Commissioners, headquartered in Boston. This new administrative body was independent of colonial control, further undermining the authority of the colonial assemblies. The Intolerable Acts, 1774. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed administrative acts designed to punish Massachusetts and strip it of its self-governance. Massachusetts Government Act. This administrative act virtually abolished the Massachusetts Charter, curtailing the town meeting and making the governor's council and judges appointed by the Crown. It was the ultimate dismantling of the Puritan administrative blueprint. Quartering Act, requiring colonists to house British troops. The passage of the Intolerable Acts was the administrative declaration of war. By destroying the local administrative procedures the colonists held sacred, Parliament forced the colonists to choose between submission to a distant, non-representative authority and the creation of an entirely new administrative structure. The answer came not from the Assembly, which was now legally neutered, but from a new, revolutionary administrative body. When the King and Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, they didn't just punish a colony, they inadvertently handed the colonists a clear administrative task: create a parallel government. The old colonial administration, the royal governor, the king's courts, the customs commissioners, was now illegitimate in the eyes of the people. The revolution was not only fought on battlefields, it was won in committee rooms where patriots drafted, adopted, and enforced new administrative procedures, often with the speed and authority of necessity. This administrative leap from subjects to self-governors was the ultimate act of development. The first revolutionary administration, committees of correspondence. The foundation of the revolutionary administration were the committees of correspondence. Born out of administrative necessity in the 1770s to share information about British policy, these committees rapidly evolved into the administrative backbone of the rebellion. Administrative procedure. Instead of relying on the compromised official mail and communication channels of the royal governors, these committees created a shadow administrative network that operated entirely outside of imperial control. They linked towns and colonies, establishing the administrative infrastructure for unified action. The administrative coup. When the royal assemblies were dissolved by the governors, as in Massachusetts, the committees simply called for the election of provincial congresses or conventions.
These bodies, elected by the same people and using the same local administrative procedures as the old assemblies, assumed the functions of the dissolved governments, effectively replacing the Crown's authority with the people's. The national administrative body, the Continental Congress. In September 1774, 12 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia, creating the First Continental Congress. This body was an administrative anomaly. It had no legal charter, no constitution, and no authority from the king. Its power came entirely from the popular administrative bodies, the conventions and committees that sent the delegates. The administrative goal was to coordinate resistance. Their most powerful administrative act was the creation of the Continental Association. Administrative procedure. The association was not a law. It was a vast intercolonial contract that mandated a complete boycott of British goods. To enforce it, Congress delegated authority back to the local committees of safety and committees of inspection. These local committees, composed of respected community members, became the primary administrative enforcement arm of the Revolution. They monitored ports, seized smuggled goods, administered oaths of loyalty, and even regulated local prices, assuming the administrative powers of police, judiciary, and economic regulator, entirely without official sanction. This was grassroots revolutionary administration, creating the new administrative states. With the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the administrative structure of the colonies collapsed completely. The Congress encouraged the former colonies to draft new state constitutions, replacing the royal charters. The administrative legacy of the colonial era was immediately apparent in these new documents. Written constitutions. The reliance on the specific documented agreements of the Mayflower Compact and the colonial charters led to the world's first constitutions that were formally written and ratified by the people. Administrative supremacy of the legislature. Because the colonial assemblies had been the administrative champions of liberty, the new state constitutions granted overwhelming power to the elected state legislatures. The governors, the executive branch, were intentionally made weak, often elected annually and deprived of significant appointment powers. Bill of Rights. Following the administrative tradition of detailing rights and procedures like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the states added specific administrative guarantees to limit the government's power over individuals. The problem of central administrative authority. The Continental Congress, operating under the immense stress of war, desperately needed central administrative authority.
Forget the myth of the heroic explorer and the noble savage. Forget the glorious conquest. The true story of how America was born is far less romantic and infinitely more frustrating. It's the story of paperwork. Yes, paperwork. Because when the first ragged ships dropped anchor, these men and women weren't just battling wilderness and disease. They were battling a terrifying concept, the blank slate. They had left the rigid, centuries-old systems of Europe behind. Now, 3,000 miles of unforgiving ocean separated them from the king's law, the established church, and the court records. They had to invent how to govern themselves from scratch. The question wasn't, can we survive? It was, how do you execute a murderer when you haven't even written down what a murder is? This is where our story begins, in the dark, frantic, utterly crucial administrative birth of the colonies. The year is 1620. We are not in the cold, wind-swept harbor of Plymouth, but in the cramped, airless stern of the Mayflower, riding the last nauseating swell of the Atlantic. The men, mostly ordinary laborers, a few ambitious merchants, and a handful of fervent religious separatists, are exhausted. But their fear is not of the storm. It is of anarchy. The colonists who sailed for Jamestown years earlier had the king's detailed, albeit often impractical, charter. These passengers, bound for the northern parts of the Virginia territory but blown far off course, had effectively nullified their existing patent. They were outside the juridical boundaries of the London Company. On November 11th, a pivotal moment of administrative genius, born entirely out of desperation, took place. William Bradford, a quiet but fiercely determined farmer, watched the rising tide of mutinous murmurs among the strangers, the non-separatist passengers. These men, knowing they were outside the legal reach of Virginia, felt no obligation to obey the Pilgrims' leadership. They threatened to use their liberty, for none had power to command them. Bradford, along with John Carver and Elder Brewster, knew that without an immediate binding agreement, the entire venture would collapse into petty squabbles and eventual famine. They didn't have a parliament. They didn't have a court system. They had a single sheet of parchment and a feather quill. The result was the Mayflower Compact. It was not a constitution. It was barely a legal document. It was a single, powerful administrative procedure, the establishment of a civil body politic. We, whose names are underwritten, do by these presents solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue of here, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. This brief paragraph, signed hastily by 41 men, was revolutionary. It asserted that the authority to govern did not come from a distant king or a faraway bishop, but from a compact among the people themselves. This was the very first self-enacted governing document in North America, establishing the fundamental administrative precedent for consent of the governed. What did this administrative change look like on the ground? It meant that when John Billington, a notorious troublemaker, refused to follow the orders of the new military commander, Miles Standish, the leaders didn't appeal to England. They consulted the Compact. They decided that this new body politic had the right to punish him. Billington was subjected to a very public, humiliating punishment, a neck and heels binding, a swift, brutal administrative act designed to solidify the power of the new law. The foundation of the entire colonial project was being laid not with grand pronouncements, but with simple, repeatable procedures. Agreement, a contract, is written and signed by the majority. Authority, the signers delegate power to select officials, for example, a governor. Enforcement, officials must use their delegated power to create just and equal laws. The immediate pressure was off, but the administrative nightmare was just beginning. They had established who could make laws, but they still had to write those laws down, create a process for judicial review, and most pressingly, figure out taxation to fund the venture, an issue that would in time tear the continent apart. If Plymouth was a colony of desperation, founded on a desperate administrative contract, Jamestown was a colony of calculation, founded on a corporate balance sheet. The Pilgrims feared anarchy. The London Company, which financed Virginia, feared bankruptcy. This fundamental difference dictated every administrative procedure they put in place, and it almost guaranteed their failure. The first years of Jamestown were not about freedom or self-governance. They were about control and labor efficiency. The Virginia Company of London had invested heavily, and their charter established a military-style dictatorship designed to turn a quick profit in gold, timber, or anything else of value. The administrative procedure was simple. The company appointed a governor and a council of men in London, who then issued detailed, often irrelevant, instructions to the leaders on the ground. There was no concept of a civil body politic here. There was only a chain of command originating 3,000 miles away. This system produced the notorious laws divine, moral, and martial, 1610 to 1612. These weren't laws for a growing society. They were the regulations of a work camp. The governor, Thomas Dale, enforced them with terrifying severity.
Administrative procedure for work. Everyone was required to work 6 hours a day for the common store. Administrative procedure for faith. Missing church 3 times could result in death. Administrative procedure for theft. Stealing food, even to stave off starvation, was punishable by being chained to a tree and left to starve. The administration was effective at controlling the laborers, but disastrous for morale and productivity. The settlers, mostly gentlemen unaccustomed to labor, and poor recruits who saw no personal stake in the company's profit, were dying in droves. They had no ownership, no voice, and thus no motivation. The colony nearly collapsed during the starving time. The birth of American democracy, a corporate pivot. By 1618, the London Company was hemorrhaging money. They realized that their purely top-down, authoritarian administrative model was unsustainable. To save their investment, they made a radical, self-serving administrative pivot. The goal was to incentivize the settlers by giving them a stake in the venture. The new administrative policy was twofold. The Great Charter of 1618. This policy ended communal ownership of land, the common store. Every settler who paid his own way or served 7 years now received 50 acres of land, the first establishment of private property rights as a foundational administrative principle in America. This was the head right system. This procedure created an immediate bureaucratic necessity, the administration of land grants, surveys, and record-keeping, laying the groundwork for all future county and state land offices. The Great Assembly. More revolutionary still, the company instructed the governor to convene an assembly of elected representatives. This was not an act of benevolence, it was a mechanism to make the settlers feel heard, thereby making them more willing to work and defend the colony. In July 1619, the first legislative assembly in the New World met in Jamestown's church choir loft. It was called the House of Burgesses. This moment established the administrative precedent for representative government on American soil. The body consisted of the governor, appointed by the company, presiding officer, the council, appointed by the company, and 2 burgesses, elected representatives from each of the 11 plantations or boroughs. The administrative genius lay in its balance of power. The company still held the ultimate veto, but the colonists now had the power to initiate legislation, to decide their local administrative procedures, taxes, and laws. They were putting the paperwork of a functional society into place. The shift from the draconian laws divine to the locally sourced resolutions of the House of Burgesses marked the crucial administrative transition in the colonies, from a military corporate dictatorship run from London to a fledgling self-governing entity where local needs dictated local procedures. It proved that freedom, even a constrained, corporate-approved freedom, was better for business than tyranny.
The war was won, but the new nation was drowning in a sea of administrative inefficiency. The states, having fought a revolution to prevent distant centralized authority from levying taxes, now possessed the very power they had demanded. This meant 13 sovereign administrations, 13 different currencies, and 13 competing commercial policies. The administrative triumph of the colonial assemblies over the crown now threatened to become the administrative ruin of the United States. The period between the peace treaty of 1783 and the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 was an administrative nightmare. It took a single terrifying event to convince the nation's leaders that the rope of sand holding the Union together had to be replaced with the solid foundation of a single, supreme federal administration. The failure of administrative coordination. The Articles of Confederation, 1781, was a logical product of the revolutionary experience, but its administrative procedures were fatally flawed, designed to prevent tyranny rather than enable effective governance. Fiscal paralysis. The national government could not compel the states to pay taxes or debts. It could only requisition funds.
States routinely ignored these requests, leaving the national treasury empty, veterans unpaid, and the government unable to service massive war debts. Commercial chaos. Congress had no power to regulate interstate commerce or negotiate binding foreign trade agreements. States began imposing tariffs on goods from other states, creating administrative barriers to trade that were choking the national economy. New York, for instance, heavily taxed goods arriving from New Jersey and Connecticut. Judicial and executive void. The Confederation lacked a national executive branch to enforce the laws and a national judiciary to resolve disputes between states. Administrative decisions made by Congress could not be legally enforced in the states, leaving the central government utterly powerless. The crisis point. Shays' Rebellion, 1786. The administrative failure was stark. The national government under the Articles could not raise a military or money to put down the rebellion, relying on a privately funded militia. This demonstrated that the existing administrative system was incapable of maintaining domestic tranquility or protecting property rights. To men like James Madison and George Washington, this was the ultimate proof that the revolution was failing. The Great Administrative Compromise, Philadelphia, 1787. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia with the mandate to revise the Articles. They quickly abandoned this administrative goal and began writing an entirely new document, the Constitution. The new administrative structure. A national judiciary, Article 3, the establishment of a Supreme Court and lower federal courts to resolve interstate disputes and provide a final, uniform interpretation of federal law, correcting the judicial void of the Confederation. The Supremacy Clause, Article 6. This administrative clause established that the Constitution and federal laws were the supreme law of the land, directly overriding any conflicting state laws. This was the most direct administrative reversal of the colonial emphasis on local, state-level supremacy. The Great Compromise, the legislature. To satisfy both the large and small states, the legislature, Congress, was divided into two houses, echoing the administrative separation seen in many colonial governments. The House of Representatives, membership based on population, satisfying the democratic demand for popular representation. The Senate, equal representation for every state, satisfying the state demand for sovereign equality. The administrative legacy achieved. The Constitution, far from being a radical break, was the culmination of colonial administrative development. It took the most successful administrative procedures and principles established over 2 centuries and scaled them up to a national level. Representative governance. It retained the elected assembly, Congress, as the central legislative body, upholding the administrative victory of the colonial assemblies over the royal governors. Written rights. The subsequent addition of the Bill of Rights ensured that the administrative protections the colonists had fought for, trial by jury, freedom of speech, due process, were guaranteed at the federal level. The power of the purse. The Constitution firmly grants the power to tax and spend to the elected representatives in Congress, Article 1, Section 8, directly affirming the most powerful administrative tool developed by the colonial assemblies. The ratification of the Constitution in 1789 marked the successful transition from a collection of independently administered colonies to a single administrative nation. The development of colonial administrative procedures had completed its arc, from simple covenants written on ships to complex, balanced federal charters, all driven by the relentless, pragmatic need to create systems that could govern free men while maintaining order. The administrative procedures of the colonial era were in essence the rough draft of the U.S. Constitution. The United States Constitution was a beautiful theory, but in 1789 it was just ink on parchment. There was no Treasury Department, no federal court system, no diplomatic service, only George Washington, a small group of congressmen, and the colossal expectation of the American people. The administrative challenge of the 1990s was to translate abstract constitutional powers into concrete, functioning daily procedures. This was the moment the federal government became a physical reality. The administrative triumvirate, creating the cabinet. President Washington understood that the creation of the executive branch was the first priority. He had to invent a cabinet and define its administrative relationship with the president and Congress. He began by establishing 3 foundational departments based on the 3 fundamental administrative needs of any nation. Department of State, Thomas Jefferson, responsible for foreign relations and the critical administrative task of managing the new nation's official documents and seals. Department of War, Henry Knox, responsible for military and defense procedures, inherited from the skeletal structures of the Continental Army. Department of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the most crucial administrative innovation. Hamilton's department quickly became the largest and most complex because it was charged with solving the nation's fiscal paralysis, the very administrative weakness that killed the Articles of Confederation. 2. Hamilton's Administrative Revolution, Fiscal Procedure. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, approached his administrative task with military precision. He saw that political stability depended on financial credibility. His program was a series of administrative maneuvers designed to centralize fiscal power and create national economic machinery. Assumption of state debts, 1790. The federal government formally assumed all Revolutionary War debts incurred by the states. The administrative goal, to create a single body of national debt, thereby transferring the loyalty of wealthy creditors, bondholders, from the individual states to the new federal government. This was a political administrative act disguised as a financial one. The First Bank of the United States, 1791. The creation of a national bank was the ultimate administrative tool. Administrative procedure. The bank served as the federal government's financial agent. It held government funds, processed tax receipts, and issued a uniform national currency. It also provided credit for the growing commercial economy. The administrative conflict. This act sparked the first major administrative and constitutional crisis. Jefferson and Madison argued that the bank was unconstitutional because the power was not expressly delegated. Hamilton argued for the doctrine of implied powers, that Congress had the administrative power to create the bank because it was necessary and proper to carry out its expressly granted power to collect taxes and regulate currency. Washington sided with Hamilton, firmly establishing the precedent of broad federal administrative authority. The judicial administrative structure. The Constitution called for a Supreme Court, but Congress had to establish the entire lower administrative structure. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was the most significant administrative bill passed by the first Congress. Administrative procedure. It established the entire 3-tiered federal court system. District courts, the lowest level, circuit courts, the middle appellate level, and the Supreme Court, the highest court. Administrative compromise. Crucially, the act granted the federal courts the authority to hear cases originating in the state courts, appellate jurisdiction over state law, but it allowed local state laws to govern most civil cases, providing a smooth administrative transition and maintaining continuity with the colonial legal past. The fourth, administrative challenge of enforcement, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. The new federal administrative system faced its true test of enforcement in 1794 with the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton's administration had imposed an excise tax on domestic distilled spirits to fund the federal government. Farmers in western Pennsylvania.
The administrative development we've tracked, from Plymouth's Covenant to the U.S. Constitution, is the story of governance. But to truly govern a vast, decentralized continent, the administrative body needs a nervous system, a reliable way to communicate. That system was the post office. The post office's history is the perfect administrative microcosm of the nation itself. Fragmented under the colonies, weak under the Confederation, and finally vital and centralized under the Republic. The fragmented colonial post, 1673 to 1753. In the early colonial period, there was no organized administrative postal service. Communication was haphazard, handled entirely by private individuals or local officials as an ad hoc duty. Administrative procedure. Letters were often left in inns or taverns, relying on a system of trust for pickup. Governors in Virginia, for instance, relied on sea captains or private messengers. Early formalization, 1673. Governor Francis Lovelace of New York established the first official postal route between New York and Boston. This was less a governmental service and more an administrative mandate to private individuals, offering a rudimentary schedule. The Royal Charter, 1711. The British Parliament finally attempted administrative centralization by extending the English Post Office Act to the American colonies, establishing a single Deputy Postmaster General for North America. However, enforcement was weak, and the colonial assemblies often resisted the centralized service, viewing it as another attempt by the Crown to exert fiscal and administrative control. The service remained slow, unreliable, and mostly useful only for official government correspondence. 2. The administrative turning point, Franklin and the profitable post, 1753 to 1774. The colonial postal service was utterly transformed under the administrative genius of Benjamin Franklin. Appointed as Deputy Postmaster General in 1753, Franklin recognized the post office as a crucial instrument for both commerce and political unity. Administrative efficiency. Franklin conducted the first true administrative audit of the Postal Service. He traveled thousands of miles, charting new, straighter, and faster post roads. He implemented standardized routes, reliable schedules, and established fair, easily understood rates. The administrative result. Franklin made the post office the first consistently profitable administrative branch in the colonies. This profitability proved that a unified, continent-wide administrative service was both possible and desirable. Political consequence. By speeding up the delivery of newspapers and letters between colonies, Franklin inadvertently created an administrative nervous system that allowed the geographically separated colonies to feel connected. This facilitated the exchange of ideas and grievances, which became critical during the Stamp Act crisis. 3. The Revolutionary Administrative Coup, 1775. When the administrative crisis with the Crown escalated, one of the first acts of the Second Continental Congress was to seize control of the postal system. Administrative procedure. In July 1775, Congress created the Constitutional Post, completely bypassing and replacing the British Royal Post. The first Postmaster General. They appointed Benjamin Franklin as the first Postmaster General of the new independent American administrative entity. The administrative goal. The post office became a key tool of revolutionary administration, ensuring that pro-independence materials circulated freely and quickly, while loyalist materials were suppressed. It was the administrative life support of the Continental Army and the new political institutions. 4. The final administrative triumph, post-1789. Under the weak Articles of Confederation, the post office struggled, unable to enforce contracts or secure reliable funding. The Constitution, however, explicitly corrected this administrative flaw. Constitutional mandate. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7 granted Congress the specific, non-negotiable administrative power to establish post offices and post roads.
This was a clear national mandate, elevating the Postal Service to a fundamental federal function. The Post Office Act of 1792, this administrative act, passed shortly after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, completed the administrative transformation. It made the post office a universal service, guaranteeing cheap, subsidized rates for newspapers and periodicals. This enshrined the administrative principle of the post office as an engine of public information and democratic discourse, not just a tool for government or commerce. It prohibited government officials from opening private letters, establishing a vital administrative protection of privacy that was foundational to American civil liberties.